Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar sponsored by FPRI's Asia program. My name is Neysun Mahboubi. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the FPRI Asia program and also director of the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm coming to you live from my office at Penn. All of us at FPRI are very grateful to you for joining us live here on Zoom. We are recording this event. It will be available later today on our website and on our YouTube channel. We will talk for about an hour. And in the course of that, there will be opportunities for you to raise questions through the Q&A function. Our theme today, stabilizing U.S.-China relations, perspectives from China. This is coming to you at a moment of extreme possibility in the U.S.-China relationship. As many of you know, we are waiting to see what the outcome of trade talks between the U.S. and China that have taken place in Stockholm over the past few days will be, and what will be the implications for the U.S.-China relationship more broadly. I'll be sharing some views rooted in having just spent 2 months in China with students from Penn, scholars with the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations, and my own research all throughout. I could not be more grateful to my dear friend, Trudy Rubin, the worldview columnist from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and also a good friend of FPRI, for agreeing to have this moderated conversation with me today. I've had lots of conversations on these themes with Trudy over the years and as recently as yesterday. And so you will be getting a window into an ongoing dialogue that I've had with Trudy. And Trudy herself, of course, we all know the amazing reporting she's done in the Ukraine in recent years. She is just back from her own 2-week visit doing on-the-ground reporting in Ukraine. And so I think, among many other things, we share this emphasis on trying to get on the ground and learning things from there. So, Trudy, thank you again for doing this. Let me hand it over to you to be the moderator for our discussion.
Thanks, Neysun. Well, I'm very jealous of you. You just spent 2 months in China this summer with a group of students and fellows in your program at an especially fraught time in U.S.-China relations. And before we get into the issues between the two countries, give us a little sense of what it was like to be there at this moment, how you were treated, and what were your main takeaways from the trip?
Sure. There was so much that I encountered over those 2 months. I will try to just distill it into a couple of major points. For me, as someone who has been trying to resuscitate academic exchange between the U.S. and China in recent years, as many in the audience will know, those kinds of exchanges between students and scholars were already under strain leading up to the pandemic, but then as a consequence of the pandemic really came down to as close to zero as you can. And in the last 3 years, since the COVID restrictions were lifted in China, we've just seen a very slow, incremental trickle of kind of getting those dynamics back. And so my first major takeaway, getting a temperature check of what are the possibilities for doing academic exchange in China, of taking students, taking scholars, having not just nominal dialogues, but real and substantive dialogues. My takeaway was that it is possible, but still quite difficult. Not so difficult as to make it impossible. So it is possible, and I was really happy with the quality of the dialogues that we were able to have, both with my students earlier in the summer and then later with the fellows who are themselves professors of the Penn Project and the future of U.S.-China relations later in the summer. But it is still extremely difficult, and that just means you have to spend a lot of time massaging all the different things that make these things possible. And of course, while we were there was the announcement that the U.S. was about to begin aggressively revoking the visas of Chinese students studying in the U.S. Shortly after that, there was some language from President Trump that suggested that that was no longer operative, that in fact, the U.S. welcomes Chinese students and scholars. But it was just another point during the course of the summer that highlighted how fraught this landscape remains and how much energy and time and attention has to go into trying to recreate those dynamics of exchange if we think they're important. My second major takeaway, to share it, I think I have to relay a bit of an anecdote from the last day that I was there, where I spoke on a panel at what is called the World Peace Forum. It's an annual conference sponsored by Tsinghua University. It was a panel on U.S.-China relations with some distinguished American and Chinese interlocutors, and I was the last speaker. And in the context of that discussion, I spoke, in my view, extremely circumspect about what the real possibilities are for the relationship. I did acknowledge, and we will talk about today, that there seems to be some momentum on both sides towards reaching some kind of a trade, if not agreement, at least a trade truce. But I encourage the entire audience to keep their expectations very much in check about how much that could stabilize the overall relationship. I certainly shot down the idea that we would reach a clear common understanding on Taiwan or have any kind of a grand bargain. I suggested a grand bargain was not really something that is plausible to expect. I did talk about how if we could keep academic exchange continuously expanding, that would be useful for the relationship. But I was also quite frank about academic exchange needing to be real, needing to be substantive, and that it was as important for journalists to be able to return to China and to be able to report without any kinds of supervision or harassment from the state that we've seen in recent years. So I actually said, and you'll appreciate this, Trudy, I said that if you do not support bringing journalists from the US and abroad back to China, and also bringing journalists from China to the US, you do not really believe in stabilizing US-China relations. That was my final point. And after I said all of that, which in my view was sort of a very almost dark view of what the landscape is right now, the moderator of the panel, who is a Chinese professor of international relations, thanked me for my incredibly optimistic and hopeful comments, which just underscored for me that the toxicity in the relationship is so high that even what I think of as quite, at least circumspect perspective on the possibilities of the relationship seems to come across as hopeful to some audiences. And so that was, to me, a big indicator of where we are in the relationship generally.
Yes. Well, I want to get back to some more details of the actual developments in the trip and the student back and forth. But first, I'd like to hear a little bit, based on all this time you spent there, on your take on current U.S. interaction. And of course, we'll start with trade, given the talks this week in Stockholm between Scott Bessent and the U.S. trade rep and the Chinese. The news coming out seems to indicate that they were inconclusive, but it also seems to indicate that the August 12th deadline for reinstalling huge tariffs on China will be extended for 90 days. That seems to be in the wind. But I'm curious to know, how do you think the Chinese assess these talks? How does it look from China? And let me preface your reply by saying that Trump has already made trade concessions to Beijing, especially lifting the ban on exports of NVIDIA's H20 chips, and which is part of the whole national security approach up until now of the U.S. towards China. And as you know, a group of China hawks, including people in the administration, the first Trump administration, and including Steve Bannon, but others who are experts on China, sent an angry letter saying that this was very dangerous. So I'm wondering a couple of things. First of all, do you think the Chinese believe they can roll Trump because he keeps sort of backing off when they put up a strong front, as they did when threatening to cut off rare earths if he didn't rescind his initial huge tariffs? So do you think they can roll him? And also, how do you assess this business of the US allowing sophisticated chips to go to China again when supposedly we're trying to put a spanner in the works of their AI development?
Sure. Great questions. I will do my best to answer them as completely as I can, and rooted in kind of my experiences in these last 2 months in China. Just to organize my response into a few parts, let me first say something about what I understand President Trump's approach to China in not just this term, but also his first term to have been, and how Chinese understand it. We sometimes will hear, certainly from US commentators, but also from Chinese commentators, this notion that President Trump's approach to China has varied wildly and swung from pole to pole. I'm not sure I agree with that. When I look at most of the first term, his China policy, I actually think it was relatively consistent leading up to the 2019, what is sometimes called the Phase 1 trade agreement. And what I think we're seeing from his administration now is more or less in line with that mode from his first term. And what that is putting pressure on China on the trade front. Of course, we've all understood that the Trump administration in the first term set in motion dynamics that are considered to be a trade war. And we also saw that in his second term in kind of raising the tariffs incrementally at first and then all the way up to 140% additional tariffs. But in both cases, I think they were driving towards some kind of a trade agreement that was the kind of trade agreement that you could see the US trying to negotiate with many other countries, so that China was not, somehow in a different category. We know that Trump cares about the US trade relationship with many different countries, and China is one of them. If you look at his administration's approach in that first term and today, all the way up to today, China is just one of many other countries. It's not somehow a different kind of country. We forget this sometimes because on account of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I believe, there's a lot of reporting about this, and I have no reason to question it, because President Trump viewed China through a different lens because of that. He was comfortable in his first term in 2020 unleashing all the people in his administration who wanted to take a much more aggressive approach to China across all the different components of the relationship, not just the trade relationship. We know many of those people are also represented in his second administration's government, but at least up to this current moment, they have not been empowered to throw out all the stops in the way they had been in 2020. And in fact, we are seeing reporting that the messaging has gone out throughout his administration to lay off on aggressive actions towards China at this particular moment while they're trying to negotiate this trade agreement. So to summarize, my first point is to just underscore that I think there is a lot of consistency on the whole in Trump's approach to China and his focus on the trade relationship. And I think the Chinese largely understand that and largely understand that Trump has a attitude towards China and an attitude towards negotiations that is more pragmatic than that maybe is the case of people that he's put in government, but has not always empowered to exercise that. And I think they also understand that President Trump possibly has more leeway, certainly more willingness, but also maybe more political space to negotiate a trade agreement than almost any other American political leader that I can think of on either side of the aisle. I certainly don't think President Biden had the either interest or political space to have the kind of negotiations that we see President Trump and his administration engaging in now. So that's point one. And I'll let you, if you want to follow up on that, and I
Yeah,
can go
let
on
me
to other
just
things.
follow up before we get to the tech stuff. Are you of the school who believes then that Trump's whole purpose is really to have a great relationship with Xi Jinping, which many experts believe? Because on the one hand, you have that obvious tendency. Trump has made it clear he wants to be in a room with the big boys and control the world. But on the other hand, from the point of view of his administration coming in, China is the big threat globally, the country with whom there is the biggest danger of a future war. We're in this huge tech rivalry. So how do you balance these? Because if he keeps giving way on trade so that he can get along to go along with Xi Jinping, what happens to the rest of the policy?
Sure. So there's only so much that I can, from a psychological perspective, there's only so much that I can reasonably guess at. I'm sure that, at some level in President Trump thinking, like he's interested in, this summit of going to China and also inviting President Xi Jinping to visit the U.S. But I actually would not put forward the idea myself that that is, that the driving factor. To me, the point that seems empirically clearest is that throughout his first administration leading up to the moment after the COVID-19 pandemic where all bets were off, but also in this administration, the biggest thing that I can see is that President Trump himself does not seem to view China as an existential threat in the way that many others in both the Republican and Democratic parties, frankly, but also others that he has sometimes appointed to positions in his administration. I think that is, there's actually, I don't think that's just because he wants to have a meeting with Xi Jinping. I think that is genuinely just his worldview. He does not see it as an existential threat. And I think that's partly connected to, I think he has a very robust view of American strength and primacy in the world. And he is not as easily swayed by this idea that, China is going to sort of surpass us. And so he wants to just find advantage in the relationship where it comes to trade issues in the same way that he wants to see advantage in the U.S. trade relationship with Canada, Mexico, many other countries that we don't view as existential threats. Now, obviously, Trudy, your particular focus and expertise is on Ukraine and dynamics vis-a-vis Russia. And I would not presume to have any views about what President Trump's relationship with either Vladimir Putin or Volodymyr Zelensky would be. But at least I can say with a high degree of confidence that however he views China and President Xi Jinping is different. They're not the same kind of dynamics. And I think there's more thought that goes into his approach to China. But as I said, and as you've indicated, there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, but including in the Republican Party, including in his administration, who do view China as more of an existential threat. And what has been just intellectually super interesting in recent days in weeks as the negotiations have progressed, the Geneva meeting, the London meeting, now the Stockholm meeting, as the messaging has gone out to administration officials throughout the government to lay off on aggressive actions, as you alluded to the restriction on selling H20 chips has been lifted. As all of that has happened, you can see a lot of disquiet on the part of the voices in the Republican Party and the MAGA movement, and even through, I think, leaks and things like that from within his government, of people who are unhappy with that direction. And to me, the main significance of that at the moment is that if these trade talks do not succeed, or if they succeed at some level, but then we can see that China is not living up to what it promises, there's a whole ecosystem of people who are ready to go to convince President Trump to go in another more aggressive direction along the lines that we saw in the last year of his first administration.
Right. I'm going to come back to the tech piece because since we're talking about the strategic issue, and I'll get to Taiwan in a second too, but one of the fascinating things about these trade talks is that Bessent has said publicly that he warned the Chinese negotiating team that Trump was serious about imposing secondary tariffs of up to 100% on countries, including China, that purchase Russian oil. And Bessent also mentioned China's supply of dual-use technology for Russia's war on Ukraine. And I can say with knowledge that China's help to Ukraine on drone manufacturing, sending dual-use parts and sending small drones, which China is the largest manufacturer in the world, Mavic drones, is of extreme help to Ukraine. Now, I mean, China is sending them to Russia, excuse me. They have now cut off any exports of small drones to Ukraine. So can you conceive of Trump actually imposing such tariffs on China on account of Ukraine? He is supposed to make an announcement just this coming week on what steps he is going to take on secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs if Putin does not agree to a ceasefire. Is this something that came up in your meetings at all?
Sure. And so I want to put a pin in that because I realize there's one big point in the overall framing that I haven't put on the table yet that I definitely think before we go too far, I want to include in the discussion. And then I will come back to this very particular question as well. The second major point, because I did speak at length about the connectivity between the first Trump administration's approach to China and the current, and the pragmatism that seems to inform President Trump's own view about the economic relationship with China and the overall relationship with China. But what I didn't say yet, and I think is really important to say, is that part of what brought the two parties to the table in Geneva, London, and now Stockholm is the Chinese reaction to that very high additional tariff rate that President Trump, in a earlier phase of his second administration, levied, the 140% tariff rate. And of course, we know that the administration was putting high tariff rates and its economic relationship with all the countries in the world. But with respect to China, China hit back quite hard, quite quickly, in restricting the sale of critical minerals to U.S. companies. And also, frankly, there was a spillover to European countries and other countries as well. But especially when it comes to the U.S., that action, which I think we always knew could be a possibility, but for some reason didn't sort of fully expect, that action had a very significant catalyzing effect in kind of relaunching kind of this more pragmatic dynamic between President Trump's negotiating team and the Chinese team. And I think what is important to emphasize about that is the following. One, to the extent that more hawkish advisors within the Trump orbit had earlier conveyed to him that if we just put enough pressure on the Chinese economy at a moment when we all know the Chinese economy is weak comparative to where it has been in the past. And that is something I can certainly, attest to from my experience in China. But to the extent the argument was made that it's weak enough that if you just put pressure on them, they will fold, that was wrong. That was just wrong advice. And all the reporting that I've seen has suggested that President Trump understood once he saw the Chinese reaction and once he saw how American companies were very quick to convey to the White House that the limiting the access to critical minerals was going to be problematic for them. I think he saw that the advice he got him was wrong. And, that has nothing to do with, as you said earlier, whether he wants to meet Xi Jinping. I think he just saw that the advice was wrong and has moved his administration based on that empirical finding, a very reasonable empirical finding, to take a different approach. So I think that is part of the story of how we got to this current moment that we must remember. Embedded in that is a danger.
Let me just interrupt because
Sure.
time is flowing and I want to get on to Taiwan. But just one more point on this, if you could just tell me briefly. So do you think it's highly unlikely that he would then put a tariff of 100% on China for purchasing Russian oil, and gas, which Russia is not going to stop?
Sure. I think, and that goes to the question you asked. I think this is all wrapped up with our approach to the Ukraine war generally, which of course you know a lot more about than I do. But I can say that for looking at how China fits into that, in many ways, China's approach to Russia and to the Ukraine war has been more stable over the last year than our own approach. I think we have kind of, and this was reflected in part when early in the Trump administration, the U.S. actually, I believe, voted against a resolution in the UN with relation to Ukraine that China was abstaining from. So China's abstaining has been stable, but we've gone from supporting resolutions in support of Ukraine to opposing them. So I think just the way in which I think Biden administration officials talked about China's approach to the war, which has included certainly propping up the Russian economy through oil purchases and also contributing in very, I think, precise ways to kind of avoid being said to be contributing directly to the battlefield, but contributing to things that then maybe end up being on the battlefield. That critique we heard from U.S. government officials in the Biden administration had a little more edge to it, I think, than maybe it does now. It's good, I think, as someone who is, as you are, deeply concerned about Russia's actions in Ukraine. I think it's good for us to continue to say that we don't want China to be supporting Russia in that way. But I don't know how much we really how much that is as important in our negotiating posture now as it would have been certainly in the Biden administration.
Yeah, it's very interesting that it's coming up now because Trump has backed himself into a corner where he has to do something next week. But anyway, putting that aside, but I do think that it's going to be an issue here. What about Taiwan? As you know, something that President Trump also did in recent days was tell Taiwan's President Lai that he could not stop over in the United States while on his way to a trip to Latin America, where there are still countries that recognize Taiwan. And Lai canceled his trip to Latin America as a result. How do you interpret that? And let me just add, we got a question about, did you hear different things from different age groups, sectors, government, academics on Taiwan, or in your conversations there? Did young people have just as strong or even stronger feelings about Taiwan than the government? But how do you interpret this move by Trump, first of all? And then what did you hear when you were there from different segments of the population?
Sure. And I'm very glad to spend a good amount of time talking about Taiwan because I think it is the thorniest issue in the U.S.-China relationship, and I do have a lot of concerns about maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait in the way that we've done since 1979 and the normalization of relations. Much less since 1949 and the communist takeover of mainland China. So let me put a few different things on the table. First,
But let me ask you to do it briefly because
sure, I will do my best. You know me well, Trudy. You know that I kind of can struggle with that, but I will do my best to be concise here. So I think the first point rooted in my experience in those 2 months in China, which included bringing fellows who have very specialized knowledge about this issue, who were, very clear and communicating the U.S. position to various Chinese audiences. I was concerned based on the summer that there is a growing sentiment among elite Chinese audiences, certainly, and maybe even the government, that this issue, which for a long time we've all been comfortable kind of kicking the can down the road, is one that needs resolution. I am not one of those people who thinks that Xi Jinping is planning an invasion in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I know there's lots of people who throw out numbers and timelines. I think his instincts are much more cautious than that. And he would not do something that was so destabilizing. I just don't think that's his style. But I did feel concerned that so many elite audiences were at least conveying that this was an issue that needed to be resolved. And I understood that to be a reflection of two things. One, a sense that, well, as long as China is increasingly isolated on the world stage, and there might be dynamics of economic decoupling, well, the costs may not be so high as they would be otherwise. That was one part of it. But the other part of it was maybe an understanding that because of President Trump's pragmatic deal-making nature, there might be an opportunity there that may not be present under a different administration. And my messaging throughout the 2 months was to really push back on that sense that some Chinese audiences have that there's a deal to be had on this issue through the Trump administration. And what I said to them was that, first of all, there's our wider political culture in the United States, which I don't think has the room to kind of cave on Taiwan. And also, there are many people throughout the Trump administration who feel very strongly about this issue. And among them, but not limited to, Bridge Colby at the Defense Department has made his whole career around how we need to orient our foreign policy towards defense of Taiwan, even to the detriment of other things.
Who's a senior policy planning
That's
person
right.
at Pentagon.
So that's that. I would root that into an experience. And now just talking about what we're seeing in the news, yes, a lot of people picked up on however it was conveyed. I don't know exactly how it was conveyed, but however it was conveyed to President Lai to maybe not do a stopover right now. I do think it's important to emphasize that that's not the first time we've
But it's the
suggested
first
that.
time in a long
First time in a long time, but in a long time in which the U.S.-China relationship has been more fraught. And so, if the goal here is to get back to a more stable footing, reiterating our traditional approach is consistent with that and is not something new necessarily. I don't think it necessarily should be read as conveying that we are ready to cave on Taiwan is my main point. We have not caved on Taiwan since 1979. There are very many people in this administration who are not at all interested in caving on Taiwan. So if there are small gestures which help to preserve the negotiating space right now that are consistent with our general approach, I would not read too much into it.
So when you were saying that there are some members of the elite who seem to feel they might get somewhere on this issue, what does that mean? Do they feel that Trump might be willing to stop supporting Taiwan, to stop arming Taiwan?
I think and there's some reporting on this as well, what I think the Chinese side would like to see from President Trump would be one of either or both of the two following statements. So one statement would be a clear statement opposing Taiwanese independence. And the other, which would be, I think, ratcheting it up a little bit, would be a clear statement supporting peaceful resolution of the Taiwan Straits issues.
But don't we have such statements on record as the result of previous communiques?
So, we get really deep into the, very precise language. I'm a lawyer by training, and so I appreciate that. And so I will say that we have indicated that we are not supporting Taiwanese independence. We have said that before. I think if President Trump were to say that again, it would be very much in line with what we've said before, but because it would come at the tail end of a few years of us being more aggressive in our rhetoric about Taiwan, it would strike people. People would notice it, but again, that is not something that is particularly new. What would be, I believe, would be newer would be if we said something kind of affirmatively pushing for peaceful reunification. I don't think we've ever exactly said that. I do think the Chinese would like to see us say that. Personally, I'm hopeful we don't say that. I'm hopeful that we don't, say something new. I think I'm more comfortable with saying what we've already said, what we've said for a long time. If that's helpful to kind of calm tensions and kind of bring things back down to status quo, I have no problem with that. But I would prefer not to see a new statement. And I am confident there's a lot of people in the Trump administration who do not want to see a new statement as well. So it would be newsworthy if there's a new statement. I'm not sure it's newsworthy if there's a reiteration of what we've said before.
Just by the way, we have a question asking, and I think it would be useful at this point. Could you just mention some of the kind of meetings you had so that people get a sense of what kind of elites you were meeting with? I mean, students, university, academics, think tanks, government. Just briefly, a little run through.
Sure. I mean, all of those categories, and this is the work of the project that I directed, Penn, the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations, which in both cases of the students and in the case of the fellows, who are, as I said, professionals and professors, they're all writing policy papers for U.S.-China policymakers, but the project has this idea that if they are willing to go to China and able to go to China, they do some field research and do some dialogues with Chinese counterparts. It's useful for their empirical knowledge that goes into their policy papers. And so in both cases, we had very similar kinds of meetings. We met, yes, as you said, with academic counterparts, and really, really, I think among the most impressive Chinese counterparts in the academic worlds at our workshop with the fellows. We were joined by people like Professor Wang Jise from Peking University and many other notable figures in the Chinese IR world, including our co-organizer, Professor Da Wei from Tsinghua University. But then also in the case of the students—
International relations world.
That's right, international relations professors. But also, our fellows and the students are writing on a lot of different kinds of issues. And so we would get subject matter experts, not just in IR, but in granular issues relating to technology competition, trade, economics, human rights, climate, and environment. We also had meetings with government departments. And that included meetings with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, meetings with, functional departments. In the past, we've met with the National Development and Reform Commission. This time, we also met at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference with a lot of retired officials who had been ministerial level at different functional departments. We also, I should mention, we also met with foreign diplomats, American diplomats, journalists. And so the overall week was quite robustly varied in the kinds of conversations we had. But I do feel like we had enough connectivity with government audiences and with academic interlocutors at a very high level that what I'm saying about, what I discerned about Chinese elite opinion is rooted in fact.
Um, eh, Given all of these conversations, just to return to Taiwan and beyond for a moment, did you come away with the sense that both from facts on the ground and from what you heard, Xi Jinping is trying to expand China's influence militarily on the ground, denial of access, spreading out to the second island chain, what's happening in South China Sea, where it's become totally militarized by the Chinese side. Was there a feeling of the US is in decline and we are going to take advantage by physical means of moving forward and denying the US and its allies access to parts of the Indo-Pacific and beyond?
Sure. And let me preface my response to this by just saying that I said earlier that maybe President Trump had been advised that the Chinese were weaker than they actually are and that they would cave on the pressure from the 140% tariffs. And it turned out that was empirically incorrect. I think that's a good lesson for American policymakers, that China is not as weak as we thought. But I also think the converse, Chinese policymakers have to be very careful not to think the US is weaker than it is. Chinese policymakers could run into the same trap. It is also empirically incorrect. And so, to the extent that the two countries can reach some kind of a more stable equilibrium, it would be because both sides understand the strengths of the other side. So if Chinese policymakers think that the U.S. is declining in terms of, as you said, its military power in the region, that would be a major miscalculation. And so part of what I think is important for people like me and our professional colleagues who are able to go to China to do is to really signal that to our interlocutors in a way that go into the system. Surely, we have seen more aggressive actions by China in the Taiwan Strait in recent years. At the same time, the U.S. has made its presence in the region known as well. I do know that the Pentagon has been doing a review of our AUKUS agreement with the UK and Australia. My guess is that that agreement will survive that review, and the ways in which we have, strengthened our alliances generally, but especially on these issues with countries in the region like Australia and Japan and South Korea, I think are things that still are meaningful. We obviously don't always agree with all those countries on all sorts of issues, and we may be in a moment now where, because of the trade talks, there's some friction. But generally speaking, I think all those countries have the same kinds of concerns about China acting aggressively in the Indo-Pacific. And I know that there's many people in the Trump administration who will want to continue to signal American interest, commitment in the region. So, whether or not President Xi Jinping sees that, whether his advisors are very clear with him about that, I can't speak to, but they should, because otherwise they can make some really big miscalculations.
Um, we have a question asking whether you picked up anything about internal unease about Xi Jinping's monopoly of power in all spheres. I don't imagine that any academics were saying anything like this to you publicly, but in your conversations with businessmen and foreign diplomats, um, or with any Chinese, did you get any hints on this?
Yeah, and let me preface my response to this by saying, you know, for both American scholars of China and Chinese scholars of the US, one of the reasons that I put so much emphasis on academic exchange and being able to go to the respective countries is because if we don't do that, if American scholars of China don't do that, and if Chinese scholars of America don't come here, we can very easily run the risk of misunderstanding, like I said earlier, actual strengths and weaknesses of the respective political systems. So we have been in a news cycle of late of, you know, clearly where the Chinese economy has vulnerabilities, and clearly there is and has long time been disquiet about aspects of Xi Jinping's administration and rule. There has been a news cycle of sort of suggesting that there might be some like regime vulnerability as a result of that. My own fairly considered view, and that's rooted in my experiences there, is that we should be capable of holding multiple thoughts at once. And one is, very much understanding that the Chinese economy is under strain. And there's all sorts of ways in which that is visible when you're on the ground there. You can, detect the ways in which, funding cuts in universities are visible. You can detect how the unemployment crisis among Chinese youth is visible. You can sort of sense the general malaise in the economic life. So we can conclude that, but at the same time, my considered view is there's absolutely no threat to regime stability. Those two things, we have to have the mental capacity to hold them both in mind at the same time. Um, you know, just because some people see that, for like a week or two, you don't see Xi Jinping in the news headlines in the same way is not a real basis for thinking that there's actually, and in fact, a lot of the things that people point to in that nature, to me, really represent more his strength in the system. He is so much in charge that he can afford to kind of step back a bit. He doesn't need to be on the news all the time. He doesn't need to be plastered over the place because he doesn't have any genuine threats to his rule. And so I do think we have to, we have to be able to hold both of those thoughts in at once and to make wise policy choices on the basis of them.
I want to get back to some details of your trip, but first, I feel like we do need to talk a little bit about the tech war.
Sure.
There has been so much talk about decoupling, and China's advances in technology, in making their own chips, and in drones, where they are the drone champions in terms of manufacturing and advances of the world. They just haven't really used them yet. Um, translate into military might. And with AI on everybody's mind, translate into economic might, translate into might in space, and so forth. Now we're allowing NVIDIA to send these chips, although the Chinese now seem to have some concerns about that, about whether there's back doors in NVIDIA chips. But do you think that means that the US has given up on decoupling? Did you get the sense that in China they didn't take it seriously? Or did you get the sense that China in tech wants to decouple from the US?
Yeah, I think the tech issues are super important, have been a major component of, U.S.-China policy discourse in recent years, and will continue to be so. I'm glad you mentioned the terminology of decoupling, because I do think, that looms over everything that we've been discussing. There have been moments, even in the past 6 months, where it seemed as if we might be trending towards actual economic decoupling. And with all the ramifications that that has for the wider relationship, I do think that the trend at the moment, and we're waiting to see when and if there will be some announcement about the Stockholm trade negotiations, but I would guess that for the moment, the trend is in the opposite direction, that we are not in a mode of decoupling. And as it pertains to the tech relationship, the announcement that NVIDIA is allowed to sell its H20 chips is obviously a big part of that story. And many of the people who wrote or signed the letter that you indicated earlier that was criticizing that decision are people who have been generally on the side of economic decoupling. So simply the fact that we are willing to let NVIDIA sell these chips, and also loosening enforcement of some of the export controls, which has been reported on as well. I think all of that indicates that the trend at the moment is away from decoupling. So then let's just talk for a moment about the way to think about that issue of the H20 chips. And I can relay like different sides of the argument. I'm not deep enough in the weeds on this particular issue to have a strong view myself, but certainly I can say that the people who are opposed to NVIDIA selling these chips feel that by selling these high-end chips, which are not NVIDIA's best chips, they are chips that are of a lower caliber than their best chips and designed specifically for the Chinese market, but still are good chips, that selling these to Chinese companies who are trying to make advances in AI in particular is somehow going to, overly strengthen those companies and their quest towards AI supremacy, getting to something like AGI faster than we are, but in ways that can also support the Chinese military in its war planning. So that's the argument against. The argument that has seemed to prevail within the White House so far, and there's a lot of reporting about this, and in particular has highlighted the role of David Sachs within the White House, and also Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA. Their argument seems to be one that, and this is something that I've seen from many other experts in this area, that export controls in general don't work, that they are not effective in delaying technological advancement from the target party, because they can find ways around them, and or because it spurs indigenous innovation, which then becomes more problematic than if they had been simply kind of like weaned on our technology, and that it's actually in our interest for them to grow used to our technology and be sort of in a way limited by that. In the same way you think, I have an iPhone, you I think have an iPhone as well. Once you're used to that, even if someone tells you that another phone might be better, you will still probably want to keep using that technology, even if it annoys you in all the ways that those of us with iPhones can be annoyed by them. And so I think there is this theory that like it's actually in our interest for Chinese companies trying to make advances in AI to be weaned on our technology, to be limited by that, in purchasing that, to give us resources where we can make further advances. Those are the two sides of the argument. The latter argument has prevailed so far. I am not in a position to tell you which one I think is correct, but I do think they are plausible arguments on both sides that we will continue to see fleshed out in the public discourse.
Before we end, I want to get back to some of the actual dynamics of your trip. You raised an important point about the need to be aware of what's going on in the other body politic as much as you can, and the need for exchanges so that you're not back to a sort of age of Soviet Kremlinology, where you're trying to figure things out without any knowledge whatsoever. Do you think that there is a danger that we are headed to an era of, I don't know what you would call it, Xi Jinpingology, where all we get is official positions because people among the elites there are afraid to talk to us. And people from this side are afraid to go study in China. Is the idea of exchanges becoming negative on both sides, sufficiently so that we're going to be cut off from human interaction? And
Absolutely, I think that that danger exists. It's existed for some time now. And frankly, even if there is a kind of a trade truce, I'm not sure that is sufficient for lifting the threat to those kinds of exchanges. It may be a necessary condition. I think certainly if we move in the direction of economic decoupling, the ability for scholars and students from both sides to go to the other countries will be severely curtailed. But simply reaching some kind of a truce or agreement will not be enough. There is enough suspicion, frankly, in both countries about scholars from the other country coming and learning things, and that's reflected in sort of sentiment among certain segments of the relevant communities, but is also reflected in actual hard-edged pieces of law and regulation. And certainly on the Chinese side, we know that there's an anti-espionage law, a data protection law that could be deployed in ways that would put American scholars and maybe even students in some danger. And we, frankly, we should be clear-eyed that we have not made it easy for Chinese scholars in the U.S. in recent years as well. So I am deeply concerned about all those sets of dynamics. And, I've been, to the extent that I have put my reputation, my credibility into fire in the public discourse in recent years, is because I think those of us who see the value of knowledge generation really can't see any other way than trying to maintain those channels, even in difficult circumstances. And to the extent that others have written about the same kinds of points, I would especially encourage listeners to look up the Substack of Lucy Hornby, who was a longtime reporter in Beijing for both Reuters and the Financial Times. She has a wonderful new Substack. She's based in the U.S. now, and she recently wrote a piece in her Substack about her own recent visit to China. And I think Lucy is good to read because for again, going back to my very first point in this discussion, Trudy, as much as I think I'm, grounded in kind of very hard-edged thinking, my reputation is, as a friend of mine recently said, engagey. So, some people might dismiss, oh, well, Neysun Mahboubi is already engagey, so we can dismiss to some extent his views on these kinds of things. But Lucy is not. Like Lucy has been, I think, a much more a hard-edged commentator in recent years. And in her Substack, one of the very first things she says is that as someone who had kind of fallen into thinking that China has become a techno-authoritarian dystopian fantasy with Xi Jinping everywhere, being on the ground there revealed that that is actually not the case. And that was, I think it was very good that she mentioned that. Now, that's not to say that everything's fine. There's all sorts of issues and all sorts of things to be critical of, and she is critical of them in her Substack, but at least calibrating so that what our critiques are the actual reality and not some kind of a more heightened version of reality that we've created in our minds because we haven't had the connectivity. I
right.
think that's important.
We,
That's important.
we have about a minute left, so I think that's a good place to end on. That it's impossible between two countries of this size, or it should be impossible to totally break contact because then you're lost in translation. But I leave it to you to sum up in 2 seconds.
Well, I don't know that I can. I mean,
You
I
don't
think that
need
is a
to
good
sum
place.
up, but
That
just
is a good place to end. I
yeah,
think that is, if there's any point that I mostly want to convey, is that, being able to go there has utility. And we should, in a what will continue to be a difficult moment, because again, I don't think that any trade agreement will resolve all of these issues, although it may be helpful to at least they not getting worse. I think if we can continue to value being able to go to the two different countries, and if the governments can at least make that possible, they don't need to do anything else, but at least make it possible for us to have those kinds of exchanges. I think it's useful, and in a discussion like today's, I hope I at least have persuaded some people who may not have thought so that they're useful. But in any case, Trudy, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so grateful
Pleasure.
that you had the time for this and that we've been able to have this conversation that we have all the time privately now in public as well. And I want to thank this great audience who tuned in today. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that you will, if you are not already a member or a partner here at FPRI, that you would consider that and continue to support all the great work that FPRI does, not just in the Asia program, but more generally. If you'd like to know more about what's going on at FPRI, please check out the website where, again, this discussion will be posted shortly. And thank you all very much for joining us today.